Hi, and welcome to RemnantWire Radio. I'm your host, Shannon Adams, and I'm excited to be here with you today as we dive more into the topic of spiritual warfare, but from a little bit of a different perspective. Obviously, you're here listening to this program because you believe what I believe. The church is suffering and inundated with a lot of debilitating problems, one of which is the inability to really understand what time we live in. Suffering with spiritual warfare and not having the weapons of the warfare and the being equipped essentially to fight it and cast down strongholds. The church is suffering with sensationalism and even addiction and so many other things in between. And we're here to help equip the church to overcome, to be overcomers, to not be victims, but to succeed in everything that God has for them, from diving into the deep topics that no one wants to talk about, and also to equip them through the Word of God to overcome any stronghold in their life so we could be active and moving. Listen, we don't have time to be inactive in a time of spirituality that is pure warfare. We live in a time like nothing we have ever seen before, where we are being attacked on a front not only emotionally and spiritually and physically, but we're being attacked geopolitically as believers. And whether that's us or whether it's our Israeli or Jewish neighbors or anybody in between, the warfare is ramping up. And it is a time to reap a harvest for the kingdom of heaven. And the only way we could do that is by being equipped. So I'm glad you're here with me. I'm glad you're listening to this program. We're going to dive into a topic a little bit different than what we normally dive into, but just the same, even more important in some ways because it ties into the entire spiritual warfare narrative. Let's talk a little bit about security. If you've heard my previous program, Voice of Truth with Shannon, you know that I was highly political. And I looked at everything going on in the world from a biblical lens. So I took everything that was going on geopolitically, and we assessed it through the lens of Scripture. And the entire point of that program was to activate the body of Christ in a grassroots movement to not only understand the things that were happening around them, but to do something about it, to be active in their community, that they can have a voice and they can promote change, whether it be on a level that is in the government, in their state, in their community, or maybe even something bigger federally, something that they felt passionate about. Well, today we're diving a little bit into that realm. Still from a spiritual perspective, we have to understand as believers that the things that happen around us aren't just coincidental. So when we see things that are going on, whether it be political, whether it has to do with homeland security, whether it has to do with counterterrorism, whether it has to do with anything in politics, specifically the LGBTQ movement, maybe it has something to do with religious ideologies that are creeping in different ways, and doctrines that fuel hatred and terrorism from a American perspective. We have to understand that all of those things have a political connotation. That at the end of the day, not only are they just political, but that underlying issue is a spiritual issue. When we have open borders and we have people coming across our borders who vehemently are against everything we believe and love, who hate Christianity and who hate capitalism, who hate our nation, we have to understand that that destruction, that systematic web of deception and terror and hatred and violence that creeps in, most likely in almost every circumstance stems from a spiritual issue, whether it be the doctrines in which fuel their hatred are against our spiritual beliefs, and it comes out in the form of violence, or anything else. And so we can't just turn a blind eye to these things. We need to understand what is happening in relationship to spiritual warfare and what's going on in our nation. So my guest today is Kyle Shideler. He's the director of senior analyst for the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. You will find all of his information on an amazing website called centersforSecurityPolicy.org, and I'm going to be linking that if you go to RemnantWireRadio.com in the actual broadcast that we're having today, which will be backed up in a podcast version for you. You'll be able to assess all the information we're going to dissect today. But Kyle's the director and senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center of Security Policy, where he conducts and research and analyzes domestic threats to the U.S., obviously our homeland, and he emphasizes on doctrines which fuel terrorism and shape a variety of kinetic and non-kinetic threats to America's security. Now, this is important, and I need you guys to understand that this gentleman who's about to join me on the program, he has briefed senior U.S. government personnel, members of Congress, federal, state, and local enforcement officers. He's testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, subcommittees on the Constitution, and in Canada, the Canadian Senate Standing Committee on National Security and Defense. He is the man, very well versed in everything we're going to talk about. And he's coming on so that you could be equipped and informed about what is happening today. We're going to go deep. We're going to dive into maybe subjects of what's happening politically that you don't like. And you might say, Shannon, I'm going to send you an email. I don't think you should mix religion with political jargon. As I said in the beginning of this program, you really can't separate the two. And when talking about spiritual warfare, let's talk about it from a spiritual perspective, which is my cup of tea, and that is my forte. And we're going to bring the hard facts for you, which is this gentleman, Kyle's cup of tea and his forte. And without further ado, Kyle, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Shannon. It's a pleasure.
I hope that I did you justice in your introduction because you're so well versed in everything that we're specifically going to talk about today. And I know that you and I can sit here for hours and probably dissect so many different things, whether it be from the Christian audience perspective of the protection of our religious sites and churches and the protection against pro-Antifa groups that want to basically destroy anything that has to do with our belief system, all the way to border security and so on and so forth. But what's really plaguing the nation today is a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge. The Bible says, my people will perish because they have a lack of knowledge. So let's give them that knowledge. Let's go ahead and help equip them with an understanding of what's really going on from a civil and religious liberties perspective, and the attacks that maybe we don't hear about in the news all the time. Maybe they're one-sided or maybe they're pointed to a specific group, but you're the man to dissect it all. What's going on now that is of the biggest interest and really a huge issue in America? I know a lot of things have changed because of Trump, and we're seeing a lot of protection efforts going on for our nation and our soil. But give me the down low. What's going on?
Well, one of the reasons I like speaking to Christian audiences like yours, Shannon, and you highlighted this a little bit in your introduction, is that what people believe impacts what they do. And people believe what they believe impacts what they confess, which is to say what they write, what they say, and that impacts what they do. And so what I do at the Center for Security Policy is I look at the various threats to our nation and our homeland, whether those are threats from jihadist organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, or whether it's far left anarchist or communist organizations such as Antifa. But I look at what they say that they believe, and I look at what they believe and how what they believe impacts the way that they operate. And then I try to take that information and share it with people who can do something about it. So sometimes that's local law enforcement officers. We hold law enforcement briefings to teach sheriff's departments or police departments about how to understand threats like jihadist terrorism or anarchist extremist groups like Jane's Revenge that was targeting pregnancy resource centers and churches a little while back, and explaining to them, if you understand what they believe, you can understand how they'll operate, which means you can beat them at their own game. And that's the goal. So that's really my focus and how I approach the problem, studying what the enemy does to figure out how we can equip people to do a better job to defeat them. One of the things that you noted is we are seeing a very considerable uptick in attacks on religious institutions. This can be both non-kinetic attacks. These are things like protests, disruptions, these sorts of things. We saw this during the aftermath of the Roe versus Wade decision, where you had groups blockading Catholic and other Christian churches, storming into the middle of communion services to disrupt these kinds of things. We saw it with pro-Hamas protesters attempting to barricade and prevent practitioners from attending a synagogue in Los Angeles. And so these kinds of disruptions, disorders, and sometimes even attacks. I mean, we've seen fire bombings against pregnancy resource centers, churches, and other pro-life institutions, for example. We've seen vandalism and attacks against campus Chabad's and other Jewish on-campus institutions, for example. All of these are targeting a religious aspect, a spiritual aspect, as you mentioned, but also a civil rights aspect. They're interfering with the rights of the American people to engage in something they have a right to do, which is their religious practice. Fortunately, we're seeing some positive movement with the Trump administration on this. The Department of Justice recently announced that they had ordered their attorneys to use the FACE Act. Your audience is probably familiar with that act. It's a federal act which prohibits demonstrators from blocking access to clinics.
Yeah.
It's traditionally has been used by the Department of Justice against pro-life protesters.
Yeah.
But it also does contain a prohibition against blockading and preventing access to churches. And so we have seen a number of prosecutions by the federal government against Jane's Revenge groups who have done that. And the Department of Justice under Trump has indicated that they're going to be more rigorous in enforcing that as well. So that'll be interesting to see. So there's some recognition of this at the federal level, but we're still seeing increased pressure all the way down to the state and local level. There was a very disruptive protest outside the Kansas state capitol a few months ago, where a group of Satanists faced off against members of the Catholic faith because the Satanists had acquired a part of the host for the Eucharist, and we're going to use it in a black mass outside the Kansas state capitol. So you can see ways in which, in the same way, I talked about what the enemy believes, these adversaries also are focused on trying to provoke their opponents to get them to do things.
They want a response.
Yes. Exactly right.
Because then they feel justified or like they could defend their position, right?
That's exactly right. So much of political violence is about provoking a response, either provoking a response or an overreaction from the government and from law enforcement, for example, or from provoking a response and an overreaction from the other political side, from counter-protesters or what have you. The goal is always to sort of drag their opponents into the gutter with them.
I call it rope-a-dope, right? They want to drag you in. And I tell people all the time, look, when these kinds of situations occur, especially from the religious or civil liberties perspective, that they want to pull you in the mud, because if they get you in the mud, you get dirty too. And so finding out where that balance is and how to react is very important. And so my goal has been, look, I'm going to educate my audience. You can easily get emotionally stimulated and respond and react. And that's exactly what the opposite side wants. They want to bring you down with them, right? Misery loves company, essentially. They want to get you off of your platform. They want to get you in the flesh, so to speak, from a spiritual perspective. But the best way to combat this, and this is my opinion, and I want your opinion on this, and direct me a little bit if you think I'm wrong or right or whatnot, but the best way to combat it is to educate yourself on the belief system in which is attacking you. So from an apologetic standpoint, you need to know how to defend your faith. You need to know how to defend your position. You need to know why you believe what you believe and what your rights are as well, right? And so if you educate yourself and you arm yourself in that manner, you can be confident and less emotionally stimulated when these things happen. And you can take it from a perspective of doing grassroots movement, having a voice, getting involved in your community level, understanding what law enforcement is doing, right? Because there also is a disconnect between us as civilians and the understanding of law enforcement's reaction. We think when we're emotionally stimulated that they should respond in maybe a more violent or aggressive manner, but there are processes to these things. And so in order to make sure that our perspective is appropriate and that we're doing what we need to do, not only to protect, but to arm with knowledge, we need to understand both sides of that coin. And if we don't, we're at a huge disadvantage.
I think that's right. I recently wrote an article for Tablet Magazine about what Christian communities could learn from this assault on this Los Angeles synagogue. One of the things that is interesting and notable and very positive about the Jewish religious community is that they understand the security dynamics very well. I mean, obviously they have very serious security concerns, both from jihadist terrorism, but also from far left anti-Semite protesters, and even from individuals on the far right. And what they have done is they've built over the years a number of community security organizations that don't just focus on the physical security of the individual religious institution. They do have church security teams, or they have private security firms that provide security, physical security. But they also provide a community protection by having organizations that represent their interests to the local government. They attend meetings. They get out in front of the local law enforcement. They address their concerns with them. And they have organizations that can provide legal support and legal backing so that, when there are protests and disruptions and vandalisms, they have on the civil side an effort that they can say, okay, we're going to go after the people that have done this to us. So that entire community structure is really necessary to have genuine security. Security is not just big guys out in front holding the door open or closed. Security is more about a broader institutional resilience. And I think that Christians need to think very seriously about how they develop similar capabilities and a willingness to engage with their local officials to provide, to receive those resources, receive that education, let them know what their concerns are, provide them with the information that they need as local officials to help you address your security concerns. And if they realize that you are engaged as a community in that effort, they'll take it much more seriously.
Yeah, you wrote in that article, here's a quote from it, the number of attacks targeting Christians are dwarfed by the attacks on Jews, but the point here is not to compare injuries, but to rather point out that both communities find themselves confronting the same or similar threats. And I think we need to understand that, and that helps us get to your point, as being involved with our officials is sometimes we compartmentalize things. Well, I'm a Christian, I go to church, I do these things, but I'm not really in the pro-pregnancy, pro-life centers. And so that's really not my battle. That's not my front. And so we kind of are remiss. We remove ourselves, though we don't like it. And then the same thing when we see the anti-Semitism, which I just did a broadcast on anti-Semitism with Pastor Chris Quintana when we discussed it, that it is a more popular thing. It's getting worse, actually, the anti-Semitic rhetoric, especially even coming from the church. But, at the end of the day, at some point, we're like, well, we're not really around synagogues. The Jews, we believe in our faith that the Jews are God's chosen people, and we're going to pray for them. And we kind of take this standoffish approach. But at the end of the day, Christians are still being attacked. And whether it's Jews being attacked, whether it's Christians being attacked, whatever, it doesn't matter what party, person, religious background is being attacked. If we don't understand that the attacks are happening and we're confronting the same demon, really, in just a different way, then we are not prepared. It's like going into battle with no armor, going into battle with no weapons. You have to understand that you are part of the battle pretty much whether you like it or not.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, you're talking about forces, adversaries that seek to disrupt you from being able to engage in your activities, your activities which you have a civil right as an American to do. And it's really important to remember also that security is only good if it allows you to continue to fulfill your mission.
Yeah.
So there are, you can build up walls, and you can, have badged locked doors, and you can have armed security, and that may be appropriate for your situation, depending on what you're doing, depending on what your threat level is. I'm not going to tell any particular institution the specifics as to what they should do, because that's going to depend on what they're doing and what their mission is and what their threat level is. But you can't increase security to the point where you can't do your mission.
Yeah.
And especially as a religious institution, they have a need to be out there among the people, to be able to speak out, to be able to hold services, to be open, right? This is one of the conflicts that arose during COVID, was the conflict between being safe and continuing to fulfill the mission as a church. And so, thinking about security for your religious institution is about balancing safety of the individual practitioners, parishioners, and balancing your ability to fulfill your mission. So that requires thinking very seriously about what it is that you do, why you do it, and how you can be safe while you continue to do it.
So are these attacks domestic in a sense that they're coming from natural-born American citizens primarily in some regard, or are these attacks on our civil liberties and justice, the things that we're facing and we're fighting, are they all from immigration, or is there like a specific number where we have an idea of where we're being attacked on what front? What's heavier on one side with heavier artillery?
Sure. So why don't we break it down and talk about two separate threats a little bit. So let's talk first about what I think is probably the leading threat to Christian practitioners, which is probably the far left, the anarchist collectives, the communist protest groups. These are guys that really tend to target Christians because they are Christian. The jihadists, sometimes you'll get some of that. They tend to aim more towards the Jewish institutions, but they will sometimes target Christian institutions as well, especially abroad.
Yeah.
But here, we're talking domestically in the United States, the individuals vandalizing churches, the individuals firebombing pregnancy resource centers, those individuals are almost wholly going to be on your anarchist and communist orientation. So this means you're talking about relatively small groups. The way anarchists are organized along lines of something called an affinity group. Mm-hmm. It's usually about 3 to 4 people that get together that say they're going to conduct what they call a direct action, which just means any political activity that you physically engage in yourselves. But they'll use that term to cover everything from dropping a sign over a freeway and disrupting traffic to firebombing something or something like that. So these anarchists are very focused on disruption, on blockading, on preventing you from being able to do what you want to do, and from expressing themselves criminally and violently through vandalism, arson, etc. And that's what we saw all throughout Jane's Revenge, that period of Jane's Revenge after Roe versus Wade. We saw the arrests were individuals that had links to groups like Antifa. They were organized on the same lines as those kinds of same types of people that were engaging in the Black Lives Matter protests and riots in 2020. It was really a continuation of that same effort, just addressed towards a different target because they were taking advantage of that political issue caused by the decision in Dobbs.
Yeah. So now we see, I was watching obviously most people now ingest news, not by the TV, but on their tablet or their phone, right? They either have a Fox app or CNN app. They're inundated with information constantly. And so it's hard to know the forest from the trees in regards to what's true, what's untrue, what's questionable. But the biggest narrative being perpetuated now as far as what I would consider terrorism is we're seeing this attack on our administration manifesting itself in the way against Dodge, right? Tesla, Elon Musk, where even in Austin and big cities, Vegas, you have people completely and utterly vandalizing, destroying personal property and, trying to set these vehicles ablaze. They're even spray painting them, trying to break windows. Doing all kinds of things, right? And that's a direct response to the political narrative that is being perpetuated and the seats of office that are currently being held by the Republican or the Conservative Party. And those we don't necessarily think are spiritually or religiously based, but you would know more. Are they, or are they just these far left individuals, which again, not my forte is the spiritual, so I would say and argue it's still spiritually based from the far left. But religiously, from a terrorist perspective, or a terrorism perspective, I should say.
Well, I think that anytime you are, you have a force that's trying to use fear to make you make a bad decision, I would argue there's a spiritual component to that.
Yeah,
That's not
all
my
the
specialty.
time.
I think about it on a political level. So politically, that would be terrorism, right? If I am using intimidation and violence against the civilian population or against the government in order to force the government to do what I want, then that is a definition for terrorism. There are other statutory limitations in terms of charging people with terrorism that we can get into if we want to, but it's not really that important. But in terms of understanding what is the political objective of these activity, it is terrorism. They are using that act of violence, that firebomb. They're using the fear that comes from vandalism and spray painting, horrible slogans on somebody's business or church or what have you, in order to provoke a political response and to cause political intimidation. So it is terrorism in that way.
Were they organized, do you think? Or is it an organized group, or were those individuals just?
So I'll get to that. So when you're looking at terrorism, you have the individuals who are conducting the activities, the physical acts of violence, the physical acts of intimidation, firebombings, what have you. But then you also have the political side. Almost every terrorist effort is going to have a nonviolent political side to it, a movement that agrees with all of the political positions of the terrorists, but doesn't actually itself engage in terrorism. If you think about it as the anarchist who goes out and firebombs a Tesla dealership, he's not on the news the next day, right? But you have these political organizations, these protest organizations that probably, if the FBI conducted a search warrant, they wouldn't find direct evidence that they were in contact with each other.
Okay.
But they share political objectives.
Yeah.
And they know, so you have these groups out there, these protest groups, they'll publish a list of people's homes and addresses and names.
It's awful.
And addresses, these doxing, right? They'll say, like, go protest these people. But they know that there are people in their movement who will do more than simply hold up a sign.
Yeah.
And they know that they achieve a political advantage from that.
Yeah.
So what they'll call this is diversity of tactics. And so when you look at an organization that says we embrace a diversity of tactics, what they are telling you is that they will not criticize criminal activity from their own side.
Interesting.
They do not oppose and they do not criticize or condemn those who engage in illegality on behalf of the cause.
I'm going to ask a question that you might not be able to answer. Maybe you will, maybe you don't want to answer. Either way, it's totally fine. We know that people like billionaires, millionaires, multi-billionaires, like George Soros, fund a lot of these organizations that, quote unquote, don't directly say they promote the violent aspect of the protesting, but we know they're funding the, quote unquote, political party or ideology behind the actions. Why doesn't the government go after those individuals funding these terrorist organizations? Is it just because of lack of proof, or what's the deal there? Because you figure most of it, BLM, Antifa, all of it, funded by a few different people. What's the problem?
Sure. So let me explain to you the way that works, and that'll help you understand a little bit about why it's challenging to go after these guys. So typically these large foundations, talking about groups like Tides, Open Society Foundation, that's George Soros's group, they're dispensing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to organizations all around the planet. Right?
Yep.
Some of those organizations are what are known as fiscal sponsors. These are groups that have a 501c3. They're tax-deductible organizations. They're nonprofits, actually, just like the nonprofit that I work for, the Center for Security Policy. We're a 501c3 educational organization. We survive entirely by donations. We don't get any from George Soros.
That's good to know. Good to know.
But we are a 501c3. We can receive donations. And most of your large foundations have clauses that require that they only donate to 501c3s.
Mm-hmm.
So what they will do is they will donate to a 501c3 called a fiscal sponsor. This is an organization whose usually sole job is to receive money from donors and then parcel it out to other smaller groups. These are groups that do not have a tax ID. They don't have a 501c3 designation. They are not themselves tax deductible, but they will have a fiscal sponsor who is. So the sponsor can receive that foundation money and then parcel it out to the various organizations to which it is intended. These organizations are typically smaller. They're usually locally based, community organizations. The one that came up a lot during BLM was bail funds. These are organizations that receive funds in order to go bail people out of jail. So they are used to dispensing small amounts of money to individuals in the form of often cash. So now what happens is these smaller community organizations, those organizations may in fact be run by ideological radicals. They then distribute those out to oftentimes various affinity groups or individuals who are engaging in the violence, in the disruption. And we know that from, for example, the case called the Stop Cop City case, or the Atlanta Police Foundation case. This was an incident where the Atlanta Police Foundation was going to build a local law enforcement training center outside Atlanta, an area controlled by the city. And various groups of anarchists and environmentalists and other direct action protesters essentially occupied the land that they were going to build this facility on. They put up an encampment. They started creating barricades. They began attacking police. They began vandalizing supporters of the Atlanta Police Foundation and nearby banks that supported the foundation. They burned construction equipment. And in one case, an individual was shot by police after he attempted to shoot police that were addressing the encampment.
Yeah.
So this was a very violent, organized political effort, right, that involved some element of political violence. What the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was able to prove was that the organization that was helping organize these protests was receiving money. They themselves were physically reimbursing protesters for all manner of expenses, including, in some cases, ammunition for firearms.
Wow.
But the organization that was doing those reimbursements, the community organization, had a fiscal sponsor. But that fiscal sponsor was run by the same three people who ran the organization. This is the allegation that's currently in court. They, in turn, were receiving money from various groups, then passing it down to this bail fund, which was then diverting money to reimburse people for engaging in criminal activities. But the reason why the police in Georgia were able to figure this out was because they had made the mistake of having the fiscal sponsor and the community organization be the same group of people.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, the same group of people were also running the website, which was promoting attacks and then taking credit for attacks afterwards.
Yeah, they didn't cover their tracks very well.
Right. So they conflated these three elements that if they had been doing things the way that I hate to say properly, but if they had been following their doctrine, so to speak, correctly, those would have been done by separate individuals. It would have been much more difficult to track. So in this case, in a way, we got lucky.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, a lot of good police work is getting lucky and is understanding how things work so that when they do make a mistake, you can be there to catch them. And the Georgia Bureau of Investigation did a really great job in that case. We're looking at over 60 individuals who have been charged with domestic terrorism, material support for terrorism, charities fraud, and conspiracy. And it's going to be a very major case coming up in the next couple of years. So watch that case with real interest. But it really did pull the curtain back a little bit on how some of this works. So it's not so simple that you can say, okay, George Soros gave $1 million to this organization, and it has a project that they gave some money to. And how do you track an individual dollar all the way down into the hands of the guy who bought spray paint or bought fireworks to build a bomb, or bought a laser to try to blind a police officer? Right? That's challenging, but that's the case that law enforcement is often called upon to make. And so it's very easy for us in the peanut gallery to say, oh, this is all, those progressive foundations are funding all this. And it's true to a certain extent. But that doesn't mean it's that easy to prove.
Yeah, and they're smarter than the average bear, so they do cover their tracks. They know just enough how they can maintain their quote-unquote innocence under political...
I mean, they've been doing this for more than 100 years.
It's crazy.
They have a lot of experience in this, and one of the reasons I like studying this so much is that they themselves publish a lot of their own history. So they will publish like history of how they see themselves as connected to the violent far left terrorists of the 1960s and 1970s, groups like the Weather Underground, in the May 19th Communist Organization, the Black Liberation Army, and they'll go all the way back to the anarchists of the 19th century. Right. So they have a very solid understanding of their own history, and they learn a lot of lessons from what's gone on in the past, and they bring all those lessons into their current activities. And so you really do need to study them to understand the way that they think in order to understand how they approach these problems. And they innovate, they're always innovating, but they're informed by that history and that doctrine.
Well, they're smart. So, and here's another misconception: Christians, believers, people, conservatives, whatever, whoever, we tend to, and I'm categorizing, I'm lumping everybody into a big, kind of, category here. So that not everybody, but follow my train of thought. We tend to believe that, the far left or these, radical groups or BLM or Antifa are just a bunch of kids that are just rejects that are angry at life and want to rebel, and they're not really intelligent. But they organize, in general, these larger organizations, they organize very, very well. They have a really good way of, like you said, they're intelligent, they know the history, they understand, they research, and they act. And I've always said, even on my previous program, gosh, if conservatives could only organize and execute in the way these people do, not violently, but I mean with history and intelligence and legal counsel and finances and occupy for the positive, we would be so much farther ahead than we are. But they always seem in some ways to have one or two steps ahead of us. They're not dumb. These people are not ignorant, and the people funding them are definitely not ignorant.
Yeah, I think one of the you mentioned how sort of most people on the right sort of see these things, and I agree that they tend to either lean in one of two directions. Either they say these people are all losers who live in their mother's basement, and they don't, they're just clowns and they need to get a job. And if they had a job and had to pay taxes, they would understand that anarchism is not a good way of life. And that actually is very often not true at all. I mean, a lot of these guys are professors, computer programmers, like very capable people. A lot of them have families, good jobs, what have you. They do these things because they believe it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they're also not supervillains. They are not, I like to say, Antifa they're not, mystical ninjas either.
Yeah.
There's only so much they can do. And, they do make mistakes and there are opportunities to take advantage. So those two, it's really something in the middle. And that's usually the case, but it's worth reminding ourselves that they are neither 10 feet tall nor utter incompetent. But you mentioned, you said, I wish we could organize the way that they know how to organize. And one of the things I like to point out, too, is that because especially you're talking about your anarchists, your Marxists, they live and breathe this political ideology, and it's all about organizing people. That's the fundamental focus of everything that they do, is organizing people to engage in politics. It's a total focus of their life. But ironically, they then actually often have to come up with a doctrine, or they have to come up with some organizing principle or organizational process in order to do something that we would actually, that normal people would do in part of normal community naturally. So you'll see, for example, an anarchist effort to do a food drive or something, right? And you think about the level of political thought that they have put into this effort that, elderly church ladies do literally every Sunday without, so much as a second thought.
Yeah.
Right. So there is an element in which, and this I think is important to understand, they are replacing what we would traditionally call civil society, which is just people doing what people do in community. with a political ideology,
Yeah.
right? And so everything they do is then, replacing. So instead of doing normal charity work, we just trying to help people, or what the church would have called works of mercy, right? They'll do mutual aid.
Yeah.
And it looks the same, but it's not the same. And it's all this political effort to try to bring people over to their ideological position. And a lot of that is done for us naturally. Unfortunately, I think, whether it's because of technology or just attitudes, a lot of that civil society has broken down.
Yeah.
We just don't have the community organizations, the community structures that we had, back in, if you want to go back to the 1950s, 1940s or earlier. And it's becoming harder for us to go to any church, right? They'll tell you it's hard to find volunteers.
Yeah, that's true.
And, so we do have this challenge now where we are finding it harder to do the things that people tend to think of community organizing as a dirty word. And that's what the left does. They do these radicals, they do this community organizing. It's like, well, but all communities are organized.
Yeah.
One way or the other. So your Rotary Club, your Lions Club, your local church, all of these things are part of your community organization and what keeps your community together. And if those things are strong, you can keep these dangerous elements out.
Yeah.
Right? If those elements are weak, if those institutions is not a popular word anymore either, but that's what they are. I mean, these are the structures of community, right? If those structures of community are weak, that is like, having a flu that sort of runs down your body and then you get really sick, right? And so that's where you start to see penetration into a community. You'll see radicals trying to recruit people, bringing people over to give them a new ideological focus. In the political space, we call that subversion. Right? In political warfare and in national security terms, we call that subversion. You're replacing the institutions and the society that people rely upon with another that has a different ideological object.
And I see that a lot in urban settings, in the larger cities. I think it's harder for community institutions because of the vast amount of people and segmentation that happens in the urban areas. Here where I live, kind of in the country, it's stronger and everyone knows everyone. You can't do anything without somebody knowing, everyone protects everyone. There's this sense of community from the church to the schools to the neighborhoods that is just, it's a beautiful thing. And I wish it could happen, I think, as fluidly in those urban settings. But then let's talk about those urban settings a little bit. I know we've been talking so long already. I know we're almost out of time, but the urban settings are starting to become a sanctuary place for larger groups. Like, for instance, East Plano Islamic Center, the Epic centers that are coming. So that's urban, that's Plano, that's city. That's Texas. Obviously, Texas is huge and there's a lot of land, no matter if you're in the city or you're in the country. So that's besides the point. But we see groups starting to almost want to create that sense of, quote unquote, institutionalized community by doing centers like that, where the rest of the city is just like operating. It's just a metropolis, and you just got your schools and your Department of Economic Development, and you're doing your roadways and your Department of Transportation, and it's functioning as most cities function. And here you have groups organizing to say, hey, by the way, we're going to come in and we're going to attempt to do this bigger and better than you. And it's kind of scary, especially when they want to be ruled by Sharia law or Islamic law. But we see again a way that they are coming together and at least attempting, whether this specific center, progresses and comes to fruition or not, they're still making moves, even in the urban setting. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so East Plano Islamic Center has raised concerns for a lot of people in Texas and even nationwide because they are trying to launch this subdivision development, really whole development. It's not even just a residential development. It's really a residential, commercial, whole
a city
state.
Within a city, basically, is what they want.
Yeah, that's right. A city within a city. It's a good way to put it. And because it is organized around that mosque, and because that mosque is led by individuals with a long established track record of Islamist ideology, of hardcore anti-Semitism, of anti-Americanism, people are legitimately concerned about that. And I think they have a very real right to be concerned about that. You said, some of these guys are open adherents and open supporters of promoting Sharia law, which is Islamic religious law, around which Islamic communities are organized. But it's a little bit different than a lot of our, what Christians might think of as canon law or some of the Jewish halakha law that covers religious practice but doesn't cover political orientation. Mm-hmm. Sharia is not that way. Sharia includes all of those religious things that we might think of as traditionally we think of as religious, but it also covers political elements, what crimes are punished and how they are punished, how the community is politically organized, things like when to go to war. Like all of those things are elements of Sharia in ways that they don't exist in the same way in other religious connotations. So that has people very concerned, and rightfully so. And what we're seeing the beginnings of a community pushback there, where you're seeing the governor has weighed in, the attorney general has weighed in and said, well, actually, we're gonna put some scrutiny here and make sure that you are abiding by state law on all of these different requirements. And I think that the state was concerned because they may have had an unpermitted funeral home and they were doing some other things and are probably continuing to do some things that are going to raise eyebrows with the state government just in terms of meeting those standards. But you're exactly right when you say this is an example of them organizing their community along their ideological lines.
Yeah.
And most of the reaction has been, and I think rightly so, on the negative side to say, well, this, look at all the ways that this conflicts with American political culture and the way we're supposed to do things in this country. And that rightfully so. But on the other side, on the affirmative side, I don't think as many people are saying, how do we organize our community the way that it ought to be organized? If these guys are coming in and doing things the way they want to do it, and nobody is stopping them. And again, I want to stress, it's important that the reasons to be concerned about this is because it's not just about religious practice.
No.
It's about political ideology.
That's right.
And that is where it runs afoul of, there are hosts of places where Sharia runs afoul of the U.S. Constitution, state constitutions, state public policy.
Yes.
For example. And so that's the part of it we're concerned about. We're not concerned about specific religious practices so much as we are concerned about where it butts up against political practice and American constitutional rights, civil rights, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And the way the Center for Security Policy, my organization, has historically responded to this concern, and it's been a concern going back for more than 2 decades now, has been in promoting something called American Laws for American Courts. Mm-hmm. And what it's a piece of legislation. It's been passed about 25 different states. But what it says is that judges will not utilize foreign law in order to make determinations that are against the U.S. Constitution, the state constitution, or state public policy. And the way this typically happens is often in places like family court, where, for example, you may have a husband and wife who were married in, let's say, Pakistan under Sharia law, and then they come to the United States. And maybe most typically the husband is trying to have a court adhere to that marriage contract, which is organized on Sharia law lines, which would deprive the woman of a number of things that state public policy and often state law says that she has a right to, whether it's, custody of children, et cetera,
yeah.
right? So those are places where, American Laws for American Courts is able to step in and say, no, you're not going to adhere to Islamic law just because this is a marriage contract signed in Pakistan. You're going to adhere to American law. Unfortunately, Texas does not have American Laws for American Courts. They do have similar legislation. It doesn't have quite the same strength. I know some people in Texas, if in state leadership, have said, well, we have a bill that should prevent groups like EPIC from imposing Sharia law, but it doesn't have the same teeth that American Laws for American Courts has. So that's something we'd like to see folks think about. If they are genuinely concerned about this, it's a good approach. But there's very little that the state can do to prevent two people from making a contract and having a mediating principle that's determined by some other agreement, right? Mm-hmm. So if you and I have a contract and we say, to determine how this contract is followed, we're going to rely on Sharia law, and Imam Bob is going to be the determining mediator.
Yeah.
There's very little that the civil government can do about that unless they are otherwise violating the law.
Yeah.
If you try to cut my hand off,
then they'll be able to step in if there's beheadings and things like that. But
a lot of those elements are very difficult to control for otherwise. And I think as religious believers, a lot of us don't want the government to get in the way of how we determine, for example, who's going to be on the board of elders of our church, or how we determine, those kinds of things. And typically, U.S. courts are very reluctant to get involved with those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So we have to be really careful about, if we're going to respond to these threats of things like Sharia, which I agree that we should, we have to be really careful about how we structure that effort to do what we want to do and not set ourselves up,
infringement of some
religious
sort.
Liberties that we want to protect.
Yeah. And you can see as Governor Abbott is, there's things that they're doing, Fair Housing Act issues that they're bringing up because, hey, you only want to have an Islamic school. You only want Islamic people to be in this center. They can only buy a house if they're like, there's a lot of issues they're bringing up that they can attempt to address to, thwart the forward movement of EPIC. The fact that, and people are going to probably email me, well, how were they even able to buy the 412 acres or whatever it was to begin with? And shouldn't have that, raised concern for the community, just like Chinese are infiltrating America by buying agricultural land, nonetheless near military installations. And, there's so many ways we could take this. And I could talk to you, like I said, I could talk to you all day if time permitted. But I really appreciate you giving the breakdowns that you have, because the motivating factor is, we need to start getting involved, but we need to also start having a better understanding, which I think you gave us, especially in this way, that, look, not everything is as black and white as we want to believe it is. So, we tend to approach things from this is right and that is wrong. Well, that's our purview from our religious backing or maybe our political ideology, but there are so many different things that are interwoven into the way that we govern our nation and how states govern their people, that these laws are in place to protect. And sometimes because we've set laws in place that they're so wonderful, we also have created a wall in which we can't cross over for maybe an opposing, ideology that is a problem, that is violent, that, is aggressive. And we have to be very careful in the way that we address this, because if we tear those walls down, then we also rightfully have a weakness where we could be attacked and not protected or infringed upon. And so we need to have an open mind. We need to understand the struggles on both sides. We need to be educated, but we also need to be active. We do need to, really start building a community that is strong spiritually. And as far as community organization, we need to start getting involved and understanding what our law enforcement is dealing with. We need to start having a voice. And moreover, we need to really understand the spiritual, from our perspective, implications of not speaking up and not doing something about it and not being educated. When you have religious organizations, radical Islamists or groups that are violent like MS-13, or anybody in between coming across our borders and systematically dismantling us from the inside out, or at least that's their attempt to, we have to start recognizing, like, hey, these attacks, spiritual or not, are happening because our lack of understanding and our unwillingness to get involved. And more people do need to get involved, because ultimately it's going to roll downhill and it's going to affect every American and every community in some form or fashion. I so greatly appreciate you being on the program. I would love to have you back because there's so much more I wanted to talk about. And then I looked at the time and I'm like, oh my gosh, time flies, especially when you're on the same wavelength and page, with passions for something. But, tell everybody and the listening audience where they could find more information. I think you've written some pretty amazing books, Understanding Black Identity Extremism, The Considerations for Law Enforcement. You wrote that. You wrote a couple other things. Let's give them some information so they can find you and find your work.
Sure. So the easiest way to track me down is centerforsecuritypolicy.org. I'm available there. You can look at my bio. You can click on that and see all the things that I've written. I'm also, if you're a social media person, I'm available on social media on, once it was called Twitter, now it's called X, at Shideler K. Pretty active there. You can follow everything that I'm doing. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about, and I would encourage your audience to check out what the Center for Security Policy is doing. We're obviously a security policy organization, so we're focused on that tip of the spear, keeping people safe part. But it's keeping people safe so that they can do the heavy lifting on the community side, on the political side, and ultimately on the spiritual side. But you can't do any of those things if you're not secure first. And so that we see that is our role, is to give people the information that they need, that law enforcement needs, that state legislatures need, in order to make the kinds of homeland security and national security decisions that will keep people safe, so that the people can do the political work that they need to do to make America the country that we all think it can be.
I know you wanted to say "Make America Great Again," but you got yourself. I was waiting for it. No, it was a pleasure having you on the program. Listen again, everybody. We want to bring information to you that's relevant and that is pertinent to your spiritual walk and your family and your life. So you start having eyes to see and ears to hear. I'm so grateful to have wonderful guests like you, Kyle, on the program. I do hope to have you on again. If you want more information, you can go to RemnantWireRadio.com. This broadcast will be under the media tab, and you will be able to get most of the things that we talked about, some of the links to articles that Kyle has written and the link to his website. So you can find information by going there as well, just in case you need to. Again, that's RemnantWireRadio.com. If you have questions or concerns or comments about how you agree or disagree with this broadcast, please email me, Shannon, at RemnantWireRadio.com. That's 2 N's, SHANNON, at RemnantWireRadio.com. I'd be happy to discuss anything we've talked about with you and give you more facts and links for your own research. Again, we want you to be Bereans, so we want you to take everything we say on this program and search it out for yourself. Don't just take what we say as talking heads as doctrine, but go out and research and be active and get intelligent about certain things that are facing our nation and you spiritually. If you want more information about Remnant Wire Radio, everything's on the website. Don't forget to follow on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify as well. We have all the broadcasts there so you could share them. If you really liked what you heard on the radio program today, it will be there. You could share it with friends and family. And you can even comment and request certain topics to be discussed, maybe with someone like Kyle or someone else that we've had on the program, or maybe there's another topic you want us to dive into. We're willing to hear what you have to say. We want you to be educated, informed, and spiritually awakened through this program. I appreciate all of you as listeners. You are amazing. I am so thankful and pray for you guys all the time. I pray that you would pray for us as well as we continue to strive for spiritual excellence and really getting into the Word and understanding our faith and understanding what we believe. I really, really, really want to encourage every single listener from the bottom of my heart to take everything we talk about to prayer, to really ask God what He has for you and your family, for you and your community, for you and your spiritual walk, and get into Scripture more and more. We talk about subjects like this not because it's just culturally relevant, but because there are spiritual implications. If we don't understand the enemy in which we face spiritually, how can then we defend ourselves? And when we talk about religious infringement, when we talk about open borders and these different cultures coming in who want our complete and utter destruction, we need to understand that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal but spiritual, but also the spiritual battle is indeed spiritual. This was another word from the wire, and until next time, everybody, God bless.